In late April 1945, somewhere east of the Elbe River, Germany, the Jeep's engine murmured quietly as Captain T. Moffat Burris gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles pale beneath the grime and dust of 6 days of continuous combat. The young paratrooper from South Carolina peered through the dirty windshield at a column of German vehicles stretching beyond sight. Behind him sat his lieutenant and a sergeant, rifles ready but hopelessly inadequate for what loomed ahead. Before them waited 15,000 German troops of an armored panzer corps. What followed would defy every rule of military logic. 1 jeep, 3 American paratroopers, 15,000 enemy soldiers equipped with tanks, artillery, and machine guns. What happened next should have been impossible. Yet within half an hour, the entire German force would surrender without firing a single round. It was not due to superior weapons or tactical genius, but to one man's audacious bluff and the psychological collapse of an army trapped between 2 advancing superpowers. The path to that unbelievable moment began not in Germany, but in a quiet town in South Carolina. Thomas Moffat Burris was born in Anderson, South Carolina, on September 22, 1919. He grew up in the textile mill country of the American South, where hard labor and quiet resolve defined a generation. After graduating from Clemson University, Burris accepted a teaching post at Orangeburg High School. By his own account, he was an easygoing small-town man who hadn't been in a fight for years. He had been part of the Reserve Officer Training Corps at Clemson, holding a commission as a reserve officer. His future appeared secure. A peaceful life teaching history to teenagers in rural South Carolina. Then came Pearl Harbor. On December 7, 1941, Japanese planes struck the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Within days, America declared war on Japan. Soon after, Germany declared war on the United States. Burris received orders for active duty in January 1942. At 22, the teacher became a soldier. But Burris did not want to be an ordinary one. He volunteered for the paratroopers, the elite airborne infantry forming a new kind of fighting force. The training was punishing. Jump school pushed men to their physical and mental extremes. Many failed. Burris excelled. He discovered within himself a strength he hadn't known. A calm under chaos, a talent for leadership, and a willingness to take risks that frightened others. By April 1942, Burris joined the newly created 82nd Airborne Division. He was the first officer assigned to the 3rd Battalion, 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment. The 82nd, called the All-American Division, drew soldiers from every U.S. state. Burris trained alongside farm boys from Iowa, factory hands from Detroit, cowboys from Texas, and dock workers from Brooklyn. Together they forged one of the most formidable combat units in American history. The 504th earned another name from the Germans who fought them: Devils in Baggy Pants. The phrase came from a diary found on a dead German officer after the Battle of Anzio, who wrote that the American parachutists were devils in baggy pants, never more dangerous than when surrounded. It was a rare compliment from an enemy not known for giving them. By May 1943, Burris and his regiment shipped out to North Africa. His first combat jump came on July 9, 1943, during the invasion of Sicily. The C-47 transport plane shuddered through heavy flak. Tracer fire streaked past. When the green light blinked, Burris leapt into darkness over enemy territory. He landed in an olive grove, gathered his scattered men, and fought toward the objective. The first of many times he would lead troops through hopeless situations. September 1943 brought the invasion of Italy at Salerno. The 504th dropped behind enemy lines to disrupt German reinforcements. Burris led his company through 5 days of relentless combat, often outnumbered, always outgunned, never beaten. General Mark Clark later credited the 504th with saving the Salerno beachhead. Then came Anzio in January 1944, a 4-month ordeal of trench warfare. German artillery hammered American positions daily. Casualties rose. Burris was wounded twice, but refused evacuation. He watched friends die in muddy foxholes. He learned that war was not about glory. It was about endurance, about keeping men fighting when everything told them to quit. His defining moment came in September 1944. Operation Market Garden. British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery conceived an ambitious plan to end the war by Christmas. Airborne troops would seize bridges across the Netherlands, creating a corridor for armor to strike deep into Germany. The 82nd Airborne was assigned the bridge over the Waal River at Nijmegen. Without it, the entire operation would collapse. On September 20th, 1944, Burris received an order that would test everything he'd learned. His company would cross the Waal in collapsible canvas boats, in broad daylight, under heavy German machine gun and artillery fire, then storm the fortified positions beyond. It was a mission no one expected to survive. Even British officers called it impossible. Yet no one refused. 26 British canvas assault boats, 19 feet long, meant for 10 men and 3 engineers, were packed with 16 soldiers apiece. With only 2 or 3 paddles per boat, men used their rifles as makeshift oars. The Waal was 400 yards wide at the crossing point, fully exposed to enemy fire. The assault began at 2:57 p.m. As the boats shoved off, machine guns tore into them. Shells burst in the water. Men screamed and vanished. Boats overturned. The river ran red. Burris led I Company from one of the 2 lead boats in the first wave. His craft was riddled with holes almost immediately. The engineer steering it, Private First Class Willard Jenkins, was killed by a 20mm shell that struck him in the head, his blood splattering across Burris's lap. The same blast wounded Burris in the ribs. Still, he ordered his men to keep paddling. After 20 minutes of hell, 6 of 16 men reached the far bank alive. Half his company died crossing that river. Only 13 boats made it across intact. Casualties totaled between 24 and 48 killed and around 70 severely wounded. But they had done it. Under deadly fire, Burris rallied the survivors. They charged the German defenses, hand-to-hand fighting in trenches, grenades, bayonets, no mercy given or asked. By nightfall, they held the northern end of the Nijmegen Bridge. British tanks were supposed to advance at once. 4 Sherman tanks from the 2nd Grenadier Guards crossed around 7 p.m., then halted. Burris waited, but the tanks didn't move. The British commander, Captain Peter Carrington, told Burris they couldn't proceed without orders because a single German anti-tank gun blocked the road. Furious, Burris, who had just lost half his company, shouted, "I've sacrificed half my men in the face of dozens of guns, and you won't move because of one?" American officers, including Major Cook, Colonel Tucker, and General Gavin himself, all tried and failed to convince the British to advance. The tanks stayed put for nearly a full day, not moving again until late the next morning. By then, Lieutenant Colonel John Frost's men at Arnhem Bridge, 11 miles away, had been overwhelmed and forced to surrender. Years later, Lord Carrington, who became Britain's Foreign Secretary, denied the confrontation ever occurred, but multiple American paratrooper accounts corroborated it, and the frustration it caused. The British delay had tactical reasons: shortages of fuel and ammunition, lack of infantry support, and a dangerously narrow dike road. But for Burris and his men, it was a bitter memory that never faded. The divide reflected competing military cultures, aggressive paratrooper ethos versus by-the-book guards mentality. Burris received the Silver Star for the Waal River crossing. The citation praised his brilliant and inspirational leadership and heroism in securing the north end of the vital Nijmegen, a highway bridge. But Burris knew the truth. Bravery had not won that battle. Audacity had the willingness to attempt what seemed impossible, the capacity to bluff when the odds were hopeless. These lessons would serve him well 6 months later. December 1944 brought the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler launched his final desperate offensive through the Ardennes forest. The 82nd Airborne rushed into combat with little food, ammunition, or winter clothing. They deployed to Vermont, Belgium, and blocked Camp Group of Paper at Chenau, delivering the Germans their first defeat of the Battle of the Bulge. Burris and his men held their positions against German tanks and artillery. They fought in sub-zero temperatures. They endured constant bombardment, but they did not break. By February 1945, they were pushing into Germany itself. The final months of the war became a race. Soviet forces advanced from the east. American and British forces drove from the west. Germany was being crushed between two massive armies. Hitler's 1,000-year Reich was collapsing in fire and blood. But the fighting was not over. German units, trapped between the advancing Allies, fought with the desperation of men who knew they were doomed. On May 2, 1945, the 82nd Airborne Division liberated Wubelen concentration camp near Ludwigslust. What Burris and his men found there defied comprehension. Approximately 1,500 to 4,000 prisoners, mere skeletons covered in skin, barely alive. Barely alive. Approximately 1,000 dead bodies lying in open pits, some evidence of cannibalism among the starving. The stench was overwhelming. Men who had fought through 2 years of combat vomited at the sight. Burris shot the lock off a door to liberate prisoners. He was among the first Americans to witness the atrocities. He ordered his troops to document everything with photographs. The world needed to see this. The world needed proof of what the Nazi regime had done. Burris later stated, "The concentration camp in Germany was the worst thing I saw during the entire war. The American army ordered the townspeople of Ludwigslust to tour the camp. German civilians were forced to see what had been done in their name." On May 7th, the 82nd Airborne conducted funeral services for 200 victims in the town square. Citizens of Ludwigslust captured German officers, and several hundred American paratroopers attended. The division chaplain delivered a stinging eulogy. The crimes here committed in the name of the German people and by their acquiescence were minor compared to those found in other German concentration camps. Here there are no gas chambers, no crematoria. These men of Holland, Russia, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and France were simply allowed to starve to death. Within 4 miles of your comfortable homes, 4,000 men were forced to live like animals. Burris stood at attention during the service. He had seen terrible things in this war. Friends blown apart by artillery, men drowning in the wild river, the charnel house of Anzio, but nothing compared to Wubelen. Nothing revealed the depths of human evil like that camp. He knew then that defeating Germany was not enough. The world needed to ensure this never happened again. By late April 1945, Allied commanders faced a strategic decision. Soviet forces were closing on Berlin from the east. American forces had reached the Elbe River from the west. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower ordered American troops to halt at the Elbe and allow Soviet forces to take Berlin. The political arrangements for post-war Germany had already been negotiated at the Yalta Conference. Berlin would fall within the Soviet occupation zone. There was no military purpose in American forces fighting their way into a city that would be handed to the Soviets anyway. But Burris chafed at the order. He was 25 years old. He had been fighting for nearly 3 years. Berlin was 40 mi away. The war was almost over, and he was supposed to just sit and wait. It went against everything in his nature. Burris was a man of action. Waiting was torture. On a day in late April, exact date uncertain, Burris made a decision. Helleter recalled telling his lieutenant and sergeant, "I cannot stand this any longer. Let us get in my jeep and drive across the river and see what we can see. See if there are some crowds still over there." It was not an official order. It was not an authorized reconnaissance. It was 3 paratroopers in a jeep driving into enemy territory because Burris was curious and restless. They drove approximately 40 mi, roughly halfway to Berlin. The roads were clogged with refugees fleeing the Soviet advance. German civilians pushed carts loaded with their possessions. Children cried. Old people stumbled along in exhaustion. The social order of Germany had completely collapsed. Authority no longer existed. Fear ruled everything. Then ahead on the road, Burris saw something that made his blood run cold. German military vehicles. Dozens of them. No, hundreds. An entire column stretching as far as he could see. Tanks, half-tracks, artillery pieces, troop carriers, supply trucks. This was not a scattered group of deserters. This was an organized military formation. A full panzer corps, probably 15,000 troops or more. Burris should have turned around immediately. 3 men in a jeep had no business confronting an armored corps. The smart play was to retreat, report the enemy position, and let division headquarters decide how to handle it. But Burris did not become one of the most decorated officers in the 82nd Airborne by always making the cautious choice. He had a different idea, a crazy idea, an idea that made no logical sense whatsoever, but it just might work. He drove straight toward the German column. His lieutenant and sergeant said nothing, but both men checked their rifles. If this went wrong, they would go down fighting. The jeep rolled up to the lead vehicle in the column. A German officer stood beside it. Burris noticed the man wore a captain's insignia. He spoke English. That was lucky. Burris climbed out of the jeep and walked directly to the German captain. He kept his hand away from his sidearm. No aggressive moves, just confidence. Pure, absolute confidence. "I am here to accept your surrender," Burris announced. His voice was steady. Matter of fact, as if this was the most natural thing in the world. As if he had not just driven 40 miles behind enemy lines with 2 other men to confront 15,000 German soldiers. The German captain stared at him in disbelief. He looked past Burris to the jeep. 2 men, 1 vehicle, no supporting troops, no tanks, no artillery, nothing. The captain's face registered confusion, then suspicion, then something approaching amusement. He gestured at the jeep and the 2 Americans waiting beside it. "Are you crazy?" he asked in heavily accented English. 3 men and a jeep? It was a fair question. Burris was indeed taking an extraordinary risk. But this was not a moment for rational assessment. This was a moment for audacity, for the kind of bluff that Burris had been perfecting since he jumped into Sicily 2 years ago. He looked the German captain straight in the eye. "I have a whole army of paratroopers and tanks right behind me," Burris said calmly. "And the Russians are right behind you. Do you want to surrender to us or to them?" It was a magnificent lie. There was no army of paratroopers behind Burris. There were no tanks. There was nothing but the same empty road they had driven down. But the German captain did not know that. And more importantly, the German captain desperately wanted to believe there might be an American army nearby, because if there was not, his only option was to surrender to the Soviets. And every German soldier knew what that meant. The Soviet Red Army had suffered unimaginable casualties fighting Germany on the Eastern Front. Over 20 million Soviet citizens died in the war. The Soviets had seen their cities burned, their people enslaved, their nation nearly destroyed. They advanced into Germany with a hunger for vengeance that terrified German troops. Stories circulated of mass executions, brutal treatment of prisoners, and systematic reprisals. True or not, German soldiers believed them. The prospect of Soviet captivity was a nightmare that haunted every Wehrmacht officer. American captivity, by contrast, seemed almost civilized. The Americans followed the Geneva Convention. They treated prisoners humanely. They did not execute officers on sight. The German captain knew all this. As he stood in the road looking at Burris, he faced a choice. He could call the Americans bluff, order his men to disarm these 3 paratroopers, continue the retreat toward wherever they were going, and eventually fall into Soviet hands. Or he could accept what this confident young captain was, offering a chance to surrender to the Americans, a chance to avoid the Red Army, a chance, however slim, to survive this war. The German captain said, "Wait a minute. He turned and walked back down the column. Burris watched him gather 3 or 4 other German officers. They formed a small group beside one of the vehicles and began an animated discussion. Burris could see them gesturing. Some pointed toward him, others pointed east toward the Soviet lines. The debate continued for several minutes. Burris stood perfectly still, his face a mask of confidence. Inside, his heart pounded. This could go either way. Finally, the German captain broke away from the group and walked back to Burris. His hand moved to his holster. Burris tensed. The lieutenant and sergeant in the jeep raised their rifles slightly. This was it. Either surrender or combat. The German captain pulled his pistol from the holster. For a brief moment, Burris thought, "Oh no, not here in the last few days of the war." The captain held the pistol, pointed it at Burris's heart, then turned it around, grip first, and extended it toward Burris, the universal gesture of military surrender. Burris accepted the pistol. He nodded to the German captain. The captain saluted behind him. The words spread down the column, "Surrender. The Americans have arrived. We are surrendering." German soldiers began dismounting from vehicles. They stacked their rifles. They removed their sidearms and placed them on the ground. Officers organized their men into orderly groups. The discipline held even in defeat. This was still a professional military force, but it was a defeated one. Burris faced an immediate problem. He had 15,000 German prisoners and no way to guard them or transport them. He had no communication with his division. He had 3 men and 1 jeep. The situation was absurd. He ordered the German officers to maintain control of their troops and begin marching west toward American lines. The Germans obeyed. Burris and his 2 men followed in the jeep, bringing up the rear of the column like shepherds hearing sheep. They drove for hours. The column of German soldiers stretched for miles. They passed through destroyed villages and abandoned checkpoints. Occasionally, they encountered American patrols who stared in amazement at the sight. Where did all these prisoners come from? The story spread quickly through American lines. Captain Burris accepted the surrender of an entire Panzer Corps with just a jeep and 2 other men. Nobody could quite believe it. When Burris finally reached 82nd Airborne Headquarters, his colonel was waiting. The colonel was not happy. Burris had defied orders. He had driven into enemy territory without authorization. He had taken unnecessary risks. The colonel did not know whether to court-martial him or commend him. For several days, Burris waited to learn his fate. Some officers argued he had shown dangerous disregard for orders. Others pointed out that he had just captured 15,000 enemy soldiers without firing a shot. In the end, the army decided that results mattered more than procedure. Burris was recommended for commendation rather than punishment. Years later, when asked about the incident, Burris was characteristically modest. "I needed a plan and quick," he said. The plan had been simple. Bluff with absolute confidence. Offer the Germans a choice between 2 outcomes, one of which was clearly preferable, and pray they took the bait. It had worked because Burris understood something fundamental about military psychology. In April 1945, the German army was broken, not just militarily but psychologically. They knew the war was lost. They knew Hitler's promises were lies. They were terrified of the Soviets and exhausted from years of fighting. All they wanted was a way out. Burris gave them one. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Germany surrendered unconditionally. Hitler had committed suicide in his Berlin bunker on April 30th. The 1,000-year Reich had lasted 12 years. The 82nd Airborne Division received the honor of occupation duty in Berlin. General George S. Patton reviewed the paratroopers and bestowed upon the division a new nickname, America's Guard of Honor. Burris stood in formation as Patton addressed them. "You are soldiers who jumped into hell and fought your way out." The war had transformed him. At 25, he was a captain, a veteran of 4 major campaigns, and one of the most decorated officers in the airborne. But the war had also changed him in ways that would take years to understand. Burris returned to South Carolina after the war. He married, started a family, and entered the construction business. He worked at Roebuck Building Company in Spartanburg, South Carolina for 15 years before starting his own firm. In 1970, at the urging of his family, Burris founded Burris Construction Company with his three sons, John Hay, Moffett Jr., and Francis. The company undertook major construction projects throughout the Southeast. Burris served as president from 1970 to 1987. In 1982, Burris Building Systems was founded as a division, then incorporated as a separate business in 1987. By Hisson Moffett Burris Jr. from 1977 to 1990, Burris served in the South Carolina House of Representatives representing Richland County. He brought the same leadership skills he learned in combat to civilian politics: direct, honest, focused on results. His constituents appreciated a man who said what he meant and did what he said. He served as minority leader for 9 years and was instrumental in building the modern Republican Party in South Carolina. He was the first minority leader in the State House of Representatives. In 1977, the film A Bridge Too Far told the story of Operation Market Garden. Actor Robert Redford portrayed a composite figure based partly on Burris and his exploits at Nijmegen. Burris served as a consultant for the film. Watching the reenactment of the Wall River crossing brought the memories surging back. He could still hear the machine guns, still see his men falling in the boats, still feel the cold water rising as the craft absorbed more and more hits. In 2000, at age 80, Burris published his memoir, Strike and Hold, a memoir of the 82nd Airborne in World War II. The book came to life through the urging and persuasion of his children. In the prologue, he wrote that he needed to come to terms with war by talking about it and reliving it with the men who had shared those same experiences. The book became essential reading for military historians and veterans alike, a first-hand account of what it meant to lead men in battle, what it demanded, what it cost, and what it left behind. On September 19, 1994, Burris made an airborne jump into the Netherlands for the 50th anniversary of Operation Market Garden. He was 4 days shy of his 75th birthday, technically still 74. The jump was organized with the Pathfinder Holland Reenactment Group at the original battlefield near Nijmegen. 15 years later, in September 2009, he returned for the 65th anniversary, making a tandem jump at age 90, strapped to a female jumper from the same group. The 3-day commemoration included a 28-person entourage of family members. He was honored by Queen Beatrix of the Netherlands and received the Nijmegen Medal of Honor from both the Queen and the city's mayor. The people of Holland had not forgotten. Fresh flowers adorned the monuments dedicated to the American soldiers who died liberating their homeland. Dutch schoolchildren learned about the paratroopers who crossed the Wall River under relentless fire. For Burris, those visits were profoundly emotional. The war held meaning because it had freed a nation from tyranny. The sacrifices had not been in vain. In 2012, at age 92, Burris spoke at Fort Jackson's quarterly Profession of Arms luncheon for the Army Training Center. For nearly an hour, he held officers, sergeants major, and staff transfixed as he recounted his wartime experiences. He told them about shooting the lock off a concentration camp gate to free prisoners, about convincing a German panzer unit to surrender, and about being among the first Americans to enter Berlin after Germany's defeat. The audience sat in absolute silence. They were listening to history itself, to a man who embodied everything the Army aspired to be. One officer later said, "What resonated most with me as a commander was his simple message. Good leaders lead from the front and never expect anything from their soldiers that they wouldn't do themselves." Because of his exceptional leadership, his men, and those who served alongside him, overcame impossible odds and accomplished every mission given to them, even under brutal conditions. In his later years, Burris spoke often about leadership, duty, and service. He addressed military gatherings, civic organizations, and schools. His message never changed. Good leaders lead from the front. Never ask your people to do something you wouldn't do yourself. Take care of your troops, and they'll take care of you. These were not abstract ideas for Burrus. They were lessons learned in blood and fire. When asked about the surrender of the 15,000 German soldiers, Burrus always provided context. It wasn't about him being daring or clever. It was about understanding the moment. Those German troops were terrified of the Soviets and simply wanted to surrender to the Americans. All he did was give them the opportunity. Any officer who understood the psychology of the situation could have done the same thing, but few had the boldness to attempt it. His decorations included the Silver Star, 3 bronze stars with Combat V for Valor, Purple Heart, 3 presidential unit citations with 2 oak leaf clusters, French Fourragère, Belgian Fourragère, and Dutch Lanyard. The 82nd Airborne Division achieved an extraordinary combat record in World War II. No. 2. 4 of its men received the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military decoration. The division earned 4 campaign streamers for action in Sicily, Italy, Normandy, and Central Europe. It liberated concentration camps, captured thousands of prisoners, and held vital objectives against staggering odds. Captain T. Moffett Burrus passed away on January 4, 2019, at the age of 99. His funeral drew hundreds of mourners, veterans who had fought with him, politicians who had served beside him, and Dutch citizens who crossed the Atlantic to honor the man who helped free their nation. South Carolina Governor Henry McMaster said, "Moffett Burrus is one of the finest leaders our state and nation have ever produced. He brought freedom to people around the world and made the lives of those he touched better and safer." The story of Burrus and the German Panzer Corps captivated national attention when first reported. Newspapers called it one of the most audacious acts of the war. Military historians studied it as a classic example of psychological warfare and individual initiative. But Burrus himself never sought fame. In later interviews, he appeared almost embarrassed by the attention, insisting he was simply doing his duty, trying to end the war without unnecessary bloodshed. Yet the incident reveals something timeless about leadership and courage. True courage is not the absence of fear, but mastery over it. Burrus was certainly afraid when he faced that German column. Any rational man would have been, but he controlled his fear. He projected confidence even when the situation was hopeless. He understood that warfare is ultimately psychological. Weapons matter, numbers matter, but mindset matters most. The German officers who surrendered to Burrus were not cowards. They were professionals who recognized when continued resistance was futile. They were caught between 2 superpowers, their nation in ruins, their cause lost. Burrus gave them a rational choice: surrender now to the Americans or be captured later by the Soviets. The fact that his bluff worked says less about his deception and more about the desperation of Germany in April 1945. Some military analysts have questioned whether every detail of Burrus's story is entirely precise. 15,000 troops is a suspiciously round number. The details are somewhat vague on exact locations and dates. Burrus himself admitted his memory of specific events had faded over the decades. Yet the core of the story is indisputable. American 82nd Airborne after action reports from late April 1945 document large numbers of German prisoners taken with minimal resistance. Division records note that Captain Burrus of I Company 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment was commended for actions involving German surrender. Multiple veterans from his unit recalled hearing about the incident shortly after it occurred. What we know for certain is this: in the final days of the war in Europe, Moffett Burrus encountered a large German military formation. Using nothing but confidence and psychological pressure, he convinced them to surrender without a fight. The exact numbers may be uncertain. The precise details may have blurred with time, but the essential truth remains. One man's audacity accomplished what an army might have struggled to achieve through force. The lessons from Burris's experience extend far beyond military history. They speak to fundamental aspects of human psychology and decision-making. When people are trapped between bad options, they will grasp at any hope of a better outcome. When authority figures project confidence, others follow even against their better judgment. When the cost of resistance seems greater than the cost of surrender, rational actors will choose surrender. Burris understood all these principles instinctively. He did not study psychology or negotiation tactics. He simply knew people, and that knowledge, combined with extraordinary courage, changed the outcome of one small moment in a vast war. The story also illustrates the chaos and fluidity of war's final days. Military historians often focus on grand strategy, major battles, and decisive campaigns. But wars do not end neatly. They dissolve into confusion. Units lose contact with headquarters. Soldiers make decisions without orders. Authority breaks down. In that chaos, individuals like Burris had opportunities to shape events in ways that would be impossible under normal military discipline. Consider what Burris did. He violated direct orders to stay west of the Ala. He drove into enemy territory without support or communication. He confronted a force that outnumbered him thousands to one. He lied about having reinforcements. He should have been killed or captured. Instead, he pulled off one of the most remarkable bluffs in military history. That combination of audacity, confidence, and calculated risk defines exceptional leadership. Compare Burris's action to the British tank commander at Nijmegen. That officer had overwhelming firepower. He had clear orders to advance. All that stopped him was a single German anti-tank gun and his own hesitation. Burris, by contrast, had nothing but a jeep and 2 other men. Yet he succeeded where the heavily armed tank commander failed. The difference was mindset. Burris understood that in the fog of war, perception matters more than reality. If you can convince the enemy you have overwhelming force, you do not need overwhelming force. In the decades after the war, Burris often reflected on how close he came to death so many times. The jump into Sicily, where he landed under enemy fire. The Salerno campaign, where bullets missed him by inches. The 2 wounds at Anzio that could have been fatal. The wild river crossing that killed half his company. The confrontation with 15,000 German soldiers that could have ended in Heist execution. At any of those moments, his life could have ended. The fact that he survived all of them seemed almost miraculous to him. But survival was not random luck. Burris survived because he was smart, because he trained harder than most, because he learned from every combat experience, and because he understood that leadership means taking the same risks you ask of your men. Men followed him, not because he ordered them to, but because he never asked them to do anything he would not do himself. That kind of leadership inspires loyalty that transcends fear. When Burris spoke about the war in his later years, he always emphasized the men he served with rather than his own actions. He talked about the privates who jumped into darkness over Sicily, the sergeants who held their squads together at Anzio, the lieutenants who died leading their platoon across the wall. For Burris, history was never about him. It was about them. The thousands of young Americans who answered their nation's call endured unimaginable hardships and helped defeat tyranny. In 2011, at age 91, Burris spoke to the United States Army Chaplain Basic Officer Leadership Course. In 2017, at age 97, he gave an interview to Fox News where he recounted his wartime experiences with the same clarity and humility he had shown throughout his life. Even in his final years, he remained committed to sharing the lessons of leadership and sacrifice with new generations. That was Burris's legacy, not the medals or the decorations, not the dramatic stories or the incredible risks. His legacy was the example he set, the standard of leadership he maintained, the way he treated his soldiers with respect and led them with courage. Young officers study his actions today not because they are exceptional in the Hollywood sense, but because they demonstrate what is possible when a leader combines competence with audacity. The jeep that Burris drove toward that German column no longer exists, scrapped decades ago. Like millions of other World War II vehicles, the road where he confronted those 15,000 German soldiers has been rebuilt and modernized. The refugees who fled the Soviet advance are long dead. The German officers who capitulated that day have faded into history. Yet the tale endures. It endures because it embodies something fundamental about the human spirit. The refusal to yield, the readiness to take impossible chances, the realization that sometimes the greatest weapon is confidence itself. In the final reckoning of World War II, T. Moffett Burris was one soldier among 16 million Americans who served. His actions were one episode among countless others, but his story exemplifies what made Allied victory possible. It was not merely industrial power or superior armaments or clever strategy. It was personal initiative. It was men like Burris who saw an opening, acted without orders, and altered outcomes through sheer daring. When Burris passed in 2019, he was among the last surviving members of his generation. The paratroopers who leapt into Sicily are nearly all gone now. The soldiers who crossed the wild river under fire have faded into memory. The veterans who freed concentration camps and witnessed the true horror of Nazi rule are disappearing. Soon, all that will remain are their stories. Stories like Burris's Bluff on a German roadway in April 1945. That story deserves remembrance, not because it was ordinary, but precisely because it wasn't. Most surrenders required drawn-out negotiations, overwhelming force, or obvious military superiority. Burris's surrender involved none of that. It was 3 men in a jeep confronting 15,000 enemy troops. It shouldn't have succeeded. But Burris wasn't concerned with what should or shouldn't happen. He understood that in the chaos of war's end, the old rules no longer mattered. He knew that desperate men believe what they wish to believe. He knew that confidence spreads, and that a bold bluff can defeat cautious hesitation. So remember this story. Remember the schoolteacher from South Carolina who became one of the most decorated paratroopers in American history. Remember the captain who parachuted into battle 4 times and always led from the front. Remember the man who crossed a river under fire, lost half his men, and kept fighting. Remember the officer who faced 15,000 enemy soldiers armed with nothing but nerve, and convinced them to surrender. Remember T. Moffett Burris. Remember that courage is not the absence of fear. Remember that leadership means standing where you ask others to stand. Remember that the impossible is often just the improbable waiting for someone brave enough to attempt it. Remember that 3 men in a jeep, armed only with confidence and perfect timing, can alter the course of history. That is the lesson of April 1945. That is the legacy of one extraordinary American soldier. That is what happens when ordinary people meet exceptional circumstances and refuse to believe that impossible means not worth trying. The jeep rolled down that German road with 3 men inside. They faced an army. They should have perished. Instead, they triumphed. And in that victory, however small in the vast expanse of World War II, lies the true essence of American military success. Not just superior firepower, not merely industrial might, but the audacity of soldiers who refused to believe they were outmatched when they knew they were right. They were outmatched when they knew they were right.